Mauritania has a dark and terrible secret. Sprawling across 1 million square kilometers of Sahara wastelands with the population scattered to the hot desert wind, it's a place not often thought of across most of the world. Consistently ranking among the world's least developed nations, where over half of the people there live in poverty, its profile reads like that of dozens of countries once ravaged by colonial rule. It's a place of incredible natural resources and undeniable human potential, combined with corruption, hardship, a long saga of compounding tragedies, and a painfully acute failure to thrive. But start pulling at nearly any loose thread, just the tiniest bit, and immediately the shroud around Mauritania's greatest secret falls away. On the world stage, Mauritania stands out in one way above all else as the final global bastion of slavery. We're not talking about modern slavery or forced labor. We're not talking about forced marriage. And we're not talking about debt bondage or human trafficking, as serious and tragically widespread as those forms of slavery are around the world. We're talking about direct and often proud ownership of human beings in a system that even the most despicable despots of history were forced to abandon a really long time ago. And although that may be Mauritania's greatest dark secret, it is not the only one. Far from it. Right now, at the outset of our discussion of Mauritania, it's very important to understand a critical bit of nuance. Although Mauritania was the last nation to officially abolish slavery, it has done so via a presidential decree passed in 1981. But unfortunately, that one fact doesn't tell nearly the whole story. Although it was abolished over 4 decades ago, the act of enslaving, or keeping as a slave another human being, was only criminalized in Mauritania in the year 2007. Since then, only a tiny handful of cases have ever been brought to trial, and fewer than 10 Mauritanians have ever faced jail time for the practice. The first person ever to be sentenced for the crime, a woman who enslaved 2 girls at age 10 and 14 as domestic servants, was jailed for only 6 months. Figures on the number of enslaved people in Mauritania are hard to establish, but if anything at all is clear, is that the practice goes far beyond isolated instances. Conservative estimates, like those by the Walk Free Foundation, have estimated that 1 to 2% of the population is enslaved somewhere between 40 and 90,000 people. Others, including not only international media organizations, but rights groups on the ground, estimate that the true number could be as high as 20%, or well over 900,000. It's the incredible disconnect between Mauritanian law and the state of affairs there in practice that led an investigative reporter working for CNN in 2012, John T. Zutter, to describe the nation as, quote, a maddening, complicated place. The Mauritanian government is by far the most prominent force in the country, trying to keep the nation's tradition of slavery quiet. As Sutter described during a field investigation there, quoting him, "The issue is so sensitive here that we had to conduct most of our interviews in secret, often in the middle of the night and in covert locations. The only other option was to do them in the presence of a government minder who was assigned to our group by the Ministry of Communications to ensure we didn't mention the topic. If we were caught talking with an escaped slave, we could have been arrested or thrown out of the country without our notebooks and footage." But per a wide range of experts and investigators who visited Mauritania, the community trying to keep its unbreakable silence goes far beyond just the government. Experts and academics within the country, community leaders, ordinary people, and even some slaves themselves all deny a reality that has been documented extensively there. Now, we'll be taking a far closer look at the way slavery works in Mauritania, the mechanisms that enable it, and the cultural history and traditions by which the practice is justified today. We'll look at all of the other appalling practices to be found in a nation so eager to keep people as property, and we'll look at some of the deeper reasons why slavery in Mauritania is kept so quiet, not just by the Mauritanian government and its population, but across the rest of the world. We're going to endeavor, as we always do, to understand this place that we're discussing, not just to skim over its surface. But in order to have any hope of accomplishing that, we first got to do 2 things: expand our focus outward and get back in time. We'll start by examining Mauritania as a whole, as it exists today. A nation inhabited by some 4.3 million people, it's an ethnically diverse place, with roughly a third of the population being of Arabic heritage, about 40% from the Haratin ethnic group that mostly concentrates in Mauritania, and the remaining 30 or so percent mostly comprised of a handful of other groups, the Halpala, the Fulani, the Wolof, and more. Several national languages are recognized there, but the official language is Arabic, specifically the Hassaniya dialect, mixing in major elements from the Berber languages of Africa's northwest. French is common there too, owing to the country's long colonial history history, and while it's not an official language, it plays a major role within the Mauritanian media and educational system. Across Mauritania, roughly 1 in 4 people live in the capital city of Nouakchott, situated on the Atlantic coast in the country's southwest. There, residents and visitors can find deep water port constructed by China, one of 2 international airports in the country, the ornate presidential palace, a Saudi Arabian-built major mosque, the National University, and more. Only one other city in the country has a current population over 100,000, the city of Nouadhibou, with its iconic and gloomy ship graveyard near the northern edge of the Mauritanian coast. Only 7 other townships are estimated to have a population over 40,000. The country is overseen by a parliament, including a single national assembly, after the country's Senate was abolished in 2017. The president is the ultimate authority in the country and appoints a prime minister directly. The country has few enemies interested in an armed conflict, and its military is built to match, although it does act as a key partner in Africa's Sahel region for other world nations. In an economic sense, Mauritania is a lot poorer than it outwardly should be. The country is rich in iron ore deposits, as well as precious copper, substantial reserves of oil and gold. For the more geopolitically minded among our viewers, who just felt the hair on the back of their neck stand up, yeah, the connection between the presence of those resources and the world's laissez-faire posture on Mauritanian slavery is not just a simple coincidence. The country is deep in debt, and much of its population has only minimal ties to any form of industry. A large proportion of the country are subsistence farmers, some living nomadically, although increasing waves of drought have forced former nomads into city slums at higher and higher rates. And when the droughts come, they force people out of what was already a nearly inhospitable landscape. Mauritania lays claim to just a hair over 1 million square kilometers of land. That's 400,000 square miles, making it the 28th largest nation on Earth by landmass. The vast majority of the land is flat and barren, with 3/4 of its territory classified as either desert or semi-desert. Spread out across orange-brown sands are occasional cliffs, ridges, and oases, while the country's coastline and southeast regions are somewhat more hospitable, featuring scrubland savanna and just a bit of tropical rainforest along the Senegal River. On the lands where people can still live, the desert is always a threat, expanding westward toward the ocean every year as high dunes are sent by the winds on a slow march. Deep in the desert lies the Richat structure, a strange series of concentric circling ridges visible from space that have been exposed after the erosion of an immense geological dome. As far as the non-human animals that survive there, their numbers are few and far between. Out in the desert, the African golden wolf and the big-eared fennec fox can still survive, largely living off rodents, birds, lizards, and similarly hardy animals. But most of the big game that once roamed the landscape has been long since driven to extinction on Mauritanian land. Cobras, pythons, vipers, monitor lizards do somewhat better in the far deserts, while the limited coastal wetlands across Mauritania are incredibly important for migrating birds making a long trip in opposite directions each year. And with the present-day nation in focus, let's wind back the clock to the first glimmers of recorded history. Can give us an insight to Mauritania as it once was. In the millennia prior to the early Islamic conquests of the 7th century, archaeological evidence suggests that modern-day Mauritania was the domain of wandering nomadic peoples, with one such group, the Barfour, essentially beginning to settle down in the territory's habitable areas. Back then, the area was far from hospitable, with dry, open savannas that hadn't yet been taken over by spreading sands. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Romans may have had some presence there, along with local groups that seem to have settled for a time and then picked up and moved on. But when, in the years of the Umayyad Caliphate, the far edges of early Muslim warbands descended upon the area, the settlements and settled people they found there were seemingly not strong enough to resist. Among the Berber tribes who had lived there, many were forced to flee toward Mali, while others traveled to lower West Africa, places that we today refer to as Ghana and Guinea and the Ivory Coast. Those who stayed would coexist with the newer Muslim arrivals, eventually adopting their religion and elements of their language. For the following 2 centuries, the people who lived in Mauritania would be pulled every which way by the empires and kingdoms that rose and fell around them. The Songhai, the Ghana, the Almohad, and more. The one major empire that claimed modern-day Mauritania as part of its territorial center instead of a frontier were the Almoravids. They, at one point, stretched as far north as modern-day Lisbon and Valencia, and as far south as Sierra Leone. But they too wouldn't last long, and as the tribes and peoples of Mauritania navigated the long march of the centuries, they'd find themselves battered from all sides by more powerful foes looking to pillage and conquer whatever little they had built. Among the groups who would leave a lasting impression were the Banu Makil, a tribe that had migrated far from their original home of Yemen and spent decades working to subjugate Mauritania's many local tribes in the Char-Boba War of the 1600s. It was the violence and subjugation of the Char-Boba years that would set the table for everything that was to come. Subjected to conquest despite their fierce resistance, the indigenous tribes of the area were forced into second-class status as the Banu Makil, particularly the Beni Hassan tribe that led them, consolidated into a clear ruling class on the territory. With the Beni Hassan came Hassania, the Arabic dialect that has been most widespread in Mauritania ever since. That new two-tiered society was rife for exploitation via slavery, which looked then, at least for the most part, similar to how it does now in Mauritania. Black Africans, or Afro-Mauritanians, descendants of the indigenous population, kept in servitude, occasionally to people of similar skin color, but typically to the wealthier, whiter Arab population. The powers and trading empires of Europe had been aware of Mauritania, or at least its coastal settlements, prior to the Charboba War, and in 1445, a Portuguese prince named Henry the Navigator set up an island trading post off the Mauritanian coast. There, Portugal took not only slaves, but lucrative acacia gums, referred to collectively as gum arabic. By the time the wars in Mauritania were over, and the Beni Hassan had taken over, the Portuguese had been replaced off the coast by the Spanish, and they by the Dutch, and they by the French. But while Mauritania's coastline was still a trade hub for both gum arabic and slaves, the local Arab and Berber population was able to stave off colonization until the 1800s. During the decades prior, local rulers had been able to transition fluidly through relations with each successive European power, floating on the tides of change that so often played out off the coast. Broadly speaking, they were pleased to do business with anyone who was looking to buy, and their ability to collect and sell all the resources these European traders could ask for kept the more voracious instincts of the colonial powers at bay. But that all changed in 1815, when, after the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, Europe's International Congress of Vienna redrew and attempted to balance the colonial holdings of each of Europe's relevant powers. During these negotiations, France staked a claim to the Senegal River, which defines Mauritania's current southern border, and also claimed the coastline running northward from the river until it hit Spanish holdings in what is today known as Western Sahara. Those claims were agreed on, and in the eyes of the European powers, that was that. Mauritania and its people were now part of a French colony. But in practice, Mauritania's experience of French colonization would be markedly different than that of many other French holdings. Unlike the atrocities France committed in Algeria, the nation's slave-driven exploitation in the Congo, or its brutal rule in other parts of the world, 19th century Mauritania largely avoided those horrors in exchange for neglect. From 1815 through the early 1900s, France was largely disinterested in Mauritania, preferring instead to focus its regional resources on Senegal to the south, where economic productivity was far higher. Instead, Mauritania was ruled indirectly for a time, with the area's colonial governors and representatives preferring to do business with the clans and imams who exerted influence there. The bare bones of French colonial policy were carried out with minimal need for oversight, and what went on outside the colonial administrators' awareness never really seemed to rise to the levels that would need addressing. While violence would erupt often along the Senegal River, occasionally spilling north as the French retaliated against local kings and emirs who had struck southward at the settlement of Saint-Louis in modern-day Senegal. Mauritania would be mostly mapped by 1860, but otherwise, the French pursued a policy in line with what the governor of Senegal had been told in a message from Paris in the 1870s, quoting here, "Let us not hear from you." In fact, it's that colonial neglect that has gone on to play a major role in the survival of old traditions in the area, with slavery very much among them. Without the intense disruptions to the old ways of life that came with colonial administration in most places, and without any colonial leaders hell-bent on shaping a territory to the will of continental Europe, Mauritania's social structures were able to persist far longer. In fact, French attempts to really assert their will on the territory didn't begin in earnest until the early 1900s. By that time, the collapse of European colonialism was just a few short decades and a couple of world wars away, and there simply wouldn't be time to devastate the communities of Mauritania so thoroughly that their ways of life would be wiped out. But unfortunately, the area's long-held customs of slavery were among the relics of the past to survive, deeply entrenched in a society that had little reason and had even less will to ever rethink the practice. Now, of course, that's not to say Mauritania never attracted the ire of the French. The late 19th century saw increased violence in the Mauritanian deserts between clans that could battle each other freely without input from the colonial administrators. And with more and more modern weapons trickling their way northward from Senegal, those battles became more common and more deadly. Eventually, that violence began coming back on the French. Expeditions that went northward were more and more likely to be attacked, with French and other Europeans killed or kidnapped in the process. When the existing French administration proved unable to do much about it, the clans of the region sought to make economic demands that would see their colonial yoke basically removed. The clans in Mauritania were isolated, but they were neither oblivious nor stupid. They knew full well what went on in other French colonies in Africa, and that knowledge, for clans so fiercely insistent on their independence, just made that independent streak even stronger. Wrestle autonomy back from the French while they were weak in Mauritania, or would never have to deal with the French at their strongest. In 1901, however, that strategy would backfire. The French decided to dispatch a new administrator to Mauritania with the goal of subduing the Mauritanian tribes via either political or military means, whatever was necessary to get the job done. At that time, the territory of modern Mauritania was divided into 3 basic spheres of influence, each under the rule of a marabout, that is, a leader who's recognized as a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Each of the 3 had their own power bases and territory, and each of them had a range of other local rivals, smaller warbands and clans, as well as each other. Rather than attempt to destroy all 3 via military means, the new French initiative promised 2 of the sheiks protection against the more militarily powerful warlords of the area in exchange for both an alliance between them and their help in convincing other powerful leaders to accept French rule. The effort was a success, and although the new administrator himself would be assassinated before France marched on the Third Marabout and his more northerly emirate, they too would fall and be forcibly assimilated to Mauritania within a decade. The first half of the 20th century in Mauritania would see continued violence from various clans in the form of occasional uprisings and more frequent raids, but the basic strategy of turning local groups against each other proved effective in the long term. The offensive against the Third Marabout had been a destructive affair, with the French opposed for several years by way of a potent jihad and their retaliation leading to the devastation of the livestock that Mauritania's remaining nomads and secluded clans relied on. Now overseen by the administration of French West Africa, also including holdings like modern-day Sudan and Niger, Mauritania was subject to wide-ranging restrictions and impositions on local rule by the colonial government. Yet even now, French Mauritania was characterized by the colonial government's unusual willingness to allow local chiefs and religious leaders to play an outsized role. Local Islamic judges were made French authorities. The sheiks and other warrior chiefs were called upon to fill out the administration, and again, the territory's local and historic structures of self-governance were able to persist in a way that was rare in most colonial rule. As a result, the independent streak that had defined Mauritania for so long was somewhat pacified, but never truly went away. And when, during the Second World War, the Vichy French government took over in French West Africa, that simmering desire for autonomy was given ample reason to boil over. With Vichy France came sweeping policies of racial discrimination and segregation in Mauritania, the repression and near destruction of democratic movements there, and French colonial statutes that had always allowed for the use of forced labor and legal inferiority for indigenous groups, who were now leveraged to their fullest and most terrifying extent. The local chiefs, now in the difficult position to either comply with the Vichy government or lose what remained of their unique colonial protections, were increasingly derided as French collaborators with the imposition of extortive quotas and mass forced labor by the Vichy government. The chiefs chose to turn to more and more brutal means of internal repression against their own people, rather than risk the complete and irreversible devastation of the peacetime system Mauritania had gotten used to. The colony was able to emerge, albeit battered, from the Vichy years, and when France's government in exile was finally able to reassume control, the reforms that came afterward would see Mauritania re-established as a French overseas territory. Forced labor was done away with, political and legal rights were re-granted to the indigenous population, and Mauritanians were even offered French citizenship. The area began holding its own elections, although in the immediate post-war years, they were restricted to fewer than 10,000 property owners, trade union members, government officials, and things like that. Universal suffrage would be granted in the mid-1950s. Mauritania was split off from Senegal to the south, and eventually it was granted the right to form its own domestic policies while remaining under French protection in foreign affairs. But while Mauritania and its traditional and religious leaders were very interested in independence, and probably a good deal more so because of the abuses suffered under the Vichy state, it didn't pursue that independence in the same way as the rest of French West Africa. The nationalism of other West African soon-to-be nations was largely absent there. After all, it made little sense within the Mauritanian system at the time. While most proto-nations of the region had deep ethnic and tribal divides in advance of independence, the people of Mauritania weren't just split on racial and class lines. They were part of a society in which those divides had never been broken down in the slightest, and where society was still very much built around them. Instead, the 1950s were a time of increased political games within the Mauritanian upper class, jockeying for position ahead of a wave of independence declarations that would eventually see Mauritania made its own nation. By the time Mauritania became a sovereign nation on November the 28th of the year 1960, there was enough of an administration and ruling class to take over, although not much more than that. In its early years as a country, Mauritania was a nation not quite so divided as simply incohesive. In the north were the peoples of Moorish descent, the Arab population, who managed much of the national political process but lived largely as nomads or semi-nomadic travelers. In the south were sub-Saharan Afro-Mauritanians near the Senegal River, while in the middle grounds, and particularly in the strategically located capital city of Nouakchott, were a number of ethnic groups that had migrated to Mauritania in the years prior to independence. They, unlike most long-time residents, were largely sedentary in their lifestyle, and with such a large portion of their population living in the capital and other important areas, they became, by necessity, the core of Mauritania's day-to-day government. But in the years shortly after independence, that multi-ethnic patchwork of peoples quickly gave way to bitter rivalries and attempts to assert control. The Arab population was best equipped to achieve political power. After all, they were the direct beneficiaries of the old French colonial system. But with their political sway and their increasing attempts to impose Arabization measures on the southern population came reminders of the brutality that the Afro-Mauritanian population had suffered under their rule for centuries, and with it, the keen awareness that many still remained enslaved by the same people attempting to impose their will over their southerly neighbors. Prior to independence, elements in the Arab-dominated north had advocated for a union with Morocco, while elements in the south had advocated becoming a part of Mali. Neither had happened. Now the nation's next move would decide just what sort of place it was going to be. And when it came to deciding that next move, no single person had more influence than the country's new president. Meet Mokhtar Ould Daddah, just 36 years old at the time of his 1960 inauguration. He had been relatively important in colonial Mauritania since his birth, born to a family descended from the Prophet Muhammad, and he had been raised as a beneficiary of the most elite Islamic education that his tribe could provide. After working for years as a translator for the French, he would go to Paris and become the first Mauritanian ever to hold a degree from a university, later becoming a lawyer in Senegal. He would, before long, rise to the top of Mauritania's nascent political leadership, and by the time Mauritania went independent, he had a reputation as a unifying figure. He had shown the French during the late 1950s that he could build a political coalition, balancing the ethnic, racial, tribal, and political groups of his lands, and when it came time for France to step out, it was Daddah who was given direct control. But whether Daddah's previous unity coalition had been a political convenience or a ploy to the French or a genuine but fleeting effort, the result was the same. Very quickly after he took Mauritania's presidency, Daddah brought the nation's largest political parties into a single ruling elite and quickly consolidated that elite into a one-party state enshrined in a newly written constitution. The reason why he had moved so quickly toward authoritarianism, according to Daddah himself, was one of practicality. After a few years watching his northern tribal elites try to exert their power over a rising multi-ethnic and often restless group of young reformers, Daddah professed that he had become worried that issues like slavery could easily drive the nation apart, and that multi-party democracy, noble as its intentions might be, was simply too much for the Mauritania that he had in front of him. Whether those concerns were genuine concerns or pretext for a power grab, it ultimately doesn't matter. Daddah would be re-elected to the presidency with no opposition 3 times over in the next 2 decades. Rather than attempt to work within the post-colonial models that France had set out for it, Daddah took Mauritania in a different direction, that of so-called Islamic socialism. That set of policies saw the country develop closer ties with China, with Daddah even making visits to Mao Zedong. Businesses and industries were nationalized, and both agriculture and industry saw rapid outward expansion as foreign interests from both France and China moved to take advantage of the massive iron ore reserves that existed there. Thousands of foreign workers streamed into the country, eventually accounting for 2/3 of the wages paid out across all of Mauritania. With time came increased threats to Daddah's rule. With increased threats came increased paranoia, and with increased paranoia came more and more everyday authoritarianism. Drought toward the end of the 1960s and the start of the 1970s didn't help matters, and when global iron ore prices faltered, Mauritania's situation faltered with it, frequently alternating between times of relative prosperity and bitter hardship. During these years, Daddah and Mauritania were reliant on a 675-kilometer-long railway built from the town of Zouarat, a particularly oil-rich area, all the way to a port city. While the Mauritanian railway was immensely helpful to the national economy, it was yet another way that the economy revolved around a single point of failure, such that disruptions, even small ones, could spiral into catastrophic side effects. Daddah wouldn't begin a domestic policy per se, but instead a military misadventure. Now, we've already published an episode on this very channel covering the disputed territory of Western Sahara, so please do check that out after this episode if you're interested. But for now, suffice it to say that Western Sahara is Mauritania's northern neighbor. Morocco had long had designs on a full annexation of the territory. They were opposed, and still are, by the ethnic Sahrawi nationalist rebel group known as the Polisario Front, and in northern Mauritania, the long resistance was a major political issue. Many of the northern Arab Moorish population had relatives fighting with the Polisarios, and many others held a deep fondness for the closely ethnically related Sahrawi people, so generally speaking, support for Sahrawi independence was quite high. But since 1957, Dadaar had made a competing territorial claim against Western Sahara, claiming that it was rightfully part of Mauritania. In 1975, looking for some mechanism to entrench his rule further against rising discontent, Dadaar reached an agreement with Morocco for both nations to jointly annex the territory. Morocco would be able to split the Polisario Front's attention and bring them down, while Mauritania would get a good bit more territory, incorporating many of the Sahrawi into their nation and further bolstering the strength of the Arab Moorish elite by welcoming many thousands of new citizens. Not only that, but the Moroccans had long ago made territorial claims to Mauritania, claims that had been ignored but could be reawakened again if Morocco ended up on the Mauritanian border. Cutting a deal with the Moroccans was a far better outcome. On paper, Dadaar's plan might have even provided the Polisario Front an off-ramp to end the conflict, providing the Sahrawis with a friendlier alternative in Mauritania, where many could continue to live on their newly annexed lands, and where sovereignty was replaced by political participation in a generally agreeable society. But in reality, the situation proved far more complex. Reluctant to ever let go of their claim to sovereignty and resentful of Mauritania's decision to side with the enemy, the Polisario Front was starkly resistant to the idea of Mauritanian annexation. Many of the Arab Moorish populations with ties to the Sahrawis ended up taking their side in the controversy, and several thousand even joined the Polisario Front outright, now that their nation had been brought into the conflict. Lacking support from the northern part of the country to fight, Dadaar attempted to leverage Afro-Mauritanian troops from the south, who had very little interest in participating in what basically boiled down to an inter-Arab conflict. They were even less open to the idea of forcibly incorporating a group that would ultimately see the Afro-Mauritanians' political power diminished even further. Worst of all, Mauritania's army was just not very good at all. It wasn't even really passable either in terms of its size or its fighting ability. Although France was willing to lend air support, it proved not to be enough, and after Mauritania's military basically crumbled in the face of Polisario counterattacks, the Sahrawis were able to run amok throughout the nation. They launched attacks on critical northern ore mines, they attacked Mauritania Railway, they struck southward to the capital city, and by 1976, Dadaar was forced to disengage from the conflict as best he could. 2 years later, it'd be overthrown and his replacement would surrender all Mauritanian claims to Western Sahara and enable a complete withdrawal from the war. Dadaar would survive this coup, but after his ouster, he would spend the rest of his life in exile in France, organizing ill-fated attempts to overthrow the Mauritanian regime. He'd only returned to his country in 2001, dying shortly afterward. After Dadaar was deposed, the new military junta didn't prove to be much better. The colonel, who now found himself in charge, had formed an openly discriminatory government, and by 1979, he was pushed out too. But the new leader, another colonel, proved somewhat more resilient. When his declaration of a full peace with the Polisario Front led Morocco to try and overthrow him with a military coup, the new leader, a man with a rather long name that we're just going to refer to as Haidala, proved more resilient than his predecessor, and he'd eventually weather a number of other coup attempts and military efforts to bring him down, including one allegedly sponsored by Libya. In the Haidala years, Sharia law would be implemented across Mauritania, or while at least formally, he would preside over Mauritania's official abolition of slavery. Haidala eventually learned that he, too, couldn't survive the onslaught of rival coups forever, and he was ousted in 1984 by his former prime minister. That man, also the proud owner of a long name that challenges our powers of pronunciation, we'll just refer to him as Taya, and he'd spend well over 2 decades as Mauritania's leader. It was Taya who would bring Mauritania into the 21st century, but if anyone in Mauritania thought that the Taya years would pass easily, they were quickly shown to be mistaken. In 1989, Tyre would see Mauritania entered into war with Senegal to the south following the alleged exposure of a coup attempt nearly 2 years earlier that Mauritanian leaders accused Afro-Mauritanian military officers of planning with Senegal's help. The war would break out after a period of heightened ethnic violence in Mauritania gave way to a border dispute at the same time as Tyre and the Senegalese presidents were hashing out a dispute around recently completed dams on the Senegal River. The mix of ethnic violence, resource rights, and political persecution of each side's ethnic minorities would eventually lead to the deaths of over 1,000 people over a 2-year conflict. Around that same time, Tyre was bringing Mauritania closer to Iraq under Saddam Hussein, a posture he maintained during and after the Gulf War, and by which he further isolated Mauritania on the world stage. In 1992, when Tyre transitioned Mauritania to a so-called democratic government, it would be in an election that was widely viewed as neither free nor fair, and that, plus Tyre's activities in terrorizing and expelling black Mauritanians from the country around that same time, backed he and his administration into a corner. Heavily dependent on foreign support and increasingly aware that it picked the wrong side to get behind, Tyre would slowly bring Mauritania back into alignment with the Western world, even officially recognizing Israel and ending a war that Mauritania and Israel had technically been engaged in but never actually fought in since all the way back in 1967. It was around this time that Mauritania began working with the United States on matters related to counter-terrorism, a relationship that picked up substantially following the September 11th attacks of 2001. Tyre proved willing to imprison Islamist leaders within the country and launch crackdowns that, although they were motivated more by self-serving political reasons, were still broadly in line with American interests. With military and diplomatic cooperation came renewed interest in Mauritania's rich resources, potentially even offshore oil, leading to previously disinterested foreign groups taking an interest in Mauritania again. That closeness to the US, as well as increased openness to and tolerance of Israel, made Tyre even more unpopular among Mauritanians, and while he would survive and eventually defeat a coup attempt in 2003, he wouldn't be so lucky 2 years later. While attending the funeral of Saudi Arabia's King Fahd al Saud, he was deposed by yet another military dictatorship. That coup was broadly supported across Mauritania, and even Tyre's own political party abandoned him, while the African Union and the United States only protested for a short time. Within a few days of the coup, Tyre was abandoned. The next military leader would relinquish power in 2007 to an elected government. But while that government would engage in early steps toward ethnic and racial reconciliation in Mauritania and in passing a more potent anti-slavery bill, it too would be deposed in yet another coup. The leader of the latest military junta would be condemned internationally, but after a long public relations campaign with the international media, he, a general named Mahmoud Ould Abdelaziz, would eventually gain tolerance, if not acceptance, from across the world. In 2009, Aziz would be elected president, and his continued engagement with the United States in counter-terror efforts would see him survive the substantial backlash against him. Under Aziz, Mauritania would begin to open itself up to new ideas, allowing non-state-owned television and cracking down on hate speech in attempts to begin addressing ethnic tension. He would establish a state agency to work toward dismantling the institution of slavery and work with a number of world nations to open Mauritania to large-scale mining and foreign investment. When the Arab Spring came calling, he was largely able to ride the wave, taking Mauritania through the unrest without any large-scale revolts or violence. Although he'd breezed through a highly suspect election in 2014, he'd stepped down peacefully in 2019, succeeded by Mauritania's current president, ex-general Mohamed Ould Ghazouani. Despite corruption scandals implicating both men and the recent start of a prison sentence for Aziz, Mauritania has been able to navigate a peaceful democratic transition in the country. Today, Mauritania is by no means out of the woods. It's still a newly stabilized nation with a long history of upheaval. But at least for the time being, it's stable, and it appears as if it'll remain stable for years to come. But now, with the history of Mauritania in full view, it's time to look straight at the nation's most deeply unsettling reality. Stable as it may be, Mauritania's stability has come with a tremendous cost: the deep and lasting entrenchment of a system that considers human slavery to be nothing short of acceptable. As we mentioned at the outset, the number of people kept as slaves in modern-day Mauritania is difficult to establish. This is a nation where it's very hard to take an accurate census at all, much less to identify and verify individuals being kept as property, and a lack of government resources and interest in addressing the problem makes it even more difficult to keep count. The nomadic and semi-nomadic nature of many of the Mauritanians who keep slaves is yet another issue, meaning that they're not only able to evade questioning about the practice as they move through harsh, hard-to-navigate deserts, but their slaves are easy to hide should the wrong person come along asking questions. According to the most conservative estimates, over 40,000 people are kept as slaves in Mauritania. According to the highest estimates, the number could crest 500,000 or more. The truth is almost certainly going to be somewhere in the middle, but just where is really difficult to say. The way that slavery works in Mauritania is at least outwardly similar to the way that slavery used to work in, say, the United States of America. People of lighter skin color, at least broadly, keeping people of darker skin color as slaves. But in Mauritania, the divide is a bit more complex. The Moorish Arab population of the country, primarily living in the northern regions, are racially diverse. Lighter-skinned or Arab Moors, collectively referred to as the Bedan, and darker-skinned people, often referred to as Black Moors, who are the most likely people within Mauritania to be enslaved. More southerly populations of black Mauritanians descended from sub-Saharan Africans have been enslaved in the past, and by some accounts, they are still enslaved today, but that's a somewhat more rare occurrence to the extent that it still happens. Mostly, slaves in Mauritania are black people from the Northwest Sahara, but here too, we've got to be precise. Black people from the Northwest Sahara collectively make up about 40% of Mauritania's population, but most among their number are not enslaved today. Those who were formerly enslaved, and the descendants of these formerly enslaved people, comprise an ethnic group known as the Haratin, and like the Bedan, they speak Hassaniya Arabic. For now, it's these two groups that we'll be talking about: the darker-skinned and traditionally enslaved Haratin, and the lighter-skinned and traditionally slave-owning Bedan. For Mauritanians, absolute slavery comes in two basic forms: forced labor and domestic servitude. Forced labor is significantly less common today than it used to be, sometimes working land owned by the Bedan and sometimes working in small-scale mines or other artisanal harvesting of natural resources. Domestic slaves will perform chores like cooking and cleaning, they'll care for the children of their enslavers, they'll tend to farms and pastures, and they'll raise and sustain animals. Men tend to be forced laborers, women tend to be domestic servants. Unfortunately, the status these slaves are forced into within their local communities are all but untethered from Mauritanian law, which, in these isolated places, matters very little. For all intents and purposes, Mauritanian slaves are chattel slaves, considered entirely the property of their enslavers and able to be bought, sold, rented, given away, and at times disposed of. Customarily, slaves that tend to animals will sleep with those animals, and multiple generations of slaves will often serve the same Bedan families, with a Haratin lineage basically passed down to member after member of a Bedan lineage. Slaves in Mauritania exist in a state of dependence on their enslavers for food, for shelter, for guidance when traveling through the desert, and anything else they could need. While public forms of discipline or public signs of enslavement, like beatings in the town square or the wearing of chains, are not common, their status as complete dependents is nearly always enough to keep them in line. For roving nomadic parties and secluded insular communities, to rebel in any way is to face ostracism, and to be ostracized could very quickly mean death. The threat of banishment or abandonment to the harsh Mauritanian desert is typically the only threat required to bring somebody in line, and for groups and communities that can go months without welcoming a single visitor, other opportunities to escape or solicit help are exceptionally rare. And when the obligation of dependence isn't enough to keep a person enslaved, religion can fill in the rest. Under local interpretations of Islam, slaves are taught that their place in paradise is bound to that of their enslaver, and that they're enslaved because that was the wish of Allah. In reality, global Islamic scholars widely agree that Muslims are prohibited from enslaving fellow Muslims, which the Haratin very much are. But those interpretations either don't make it to the slaves owned by the Bedan, or are not taken seriously as they conflict with a way of life that has persisted there for many generations. To question slavery in their world is to rebel in a fundamental way against the Islam that they know. For women, escape is even harder. During the waves of emancipation that have slowly whittled down Mauritania's enslaved population, women tend not to be emancipated when men are. Instead, they're kept in domestic servitude, but tending to the home of their enslaver is not their only obligation. Within the cultural tradition that underlies Mauritanian slavery, any child born to an enslaved woman, regardless of the identity of the father, is considered property of the Bedan man who enslaves their mother. They are, from birth, an enslaved member of his labor force, and their mothers, like it or not, are the system by which the Bedan can extend and enlarge that labor force. When they're of childbearing age, women are considered especially valuable as slaves due to their potential to continue the matriarchal line of slaves they themselves were born into. Women are often raped and forced to carry the resulting children to term, even when they're the children of their slave owner as well. And speaking of those children, child labor is common among Mauritanian slave-owning communities. Denied an education and denied time or space to live as children as they would elsewhere in the world, Harritan children born into slavery are likely to be forced into labor or servitude as soon as their bodies have grown enough to handle the task, even for people who were once enslaved but are no longer. Mauritania's social systems operate in a way that they remain socially bound to their former enslavers. It is very hard for freed Harritan in their communities to break free from control by the Badan. After all, in towns, villages, hamlets, and roving parties, the Badan are the ones who typically control wealth, who have a need for labor, who control where nomadic parties move, and whose higher social standing entitles them to act as local authorities. Mauritania's socioeconomic structure, especially in the north, works in a way that is contingent on slavery, and even when the practice of slavery itself is outlawed or ended locally, or a person is freed on an individual level, they're still deeply enmeshed in a society that can only offer them a place basically consistent with what a slave would endure. There is nearly no way to ever collect enough money to start an easier life elsewhere, and given the choice between trying to make it in the slums of Nouakchott and remaining conditions that amount to near slavery in a community that people know and are entrenched in, well, unfortunately, it's often an easy decision. As a result of those cultural realities, Mauritania has come to occupy a strange position at the intersection of more archaic forms of slavery and modern slavery. That's a more common situation across today's world, modern slavery, in which people are legally classified as free or emancipated rather than slaves, but still live in conditions that functionally amount to slavery. In Mauritania, modern slavery is a fact of life too, and it's considerably more common than the sorts of, shall we say, absolute slavery that a small proportion of the country is forced to live under. But both exist at once, often in the same communities, and in a setting where escape from one basically means a transition into the other. Under threat of poverty, kept off registries that would allow people to access education or basic resources, and completely without social ties except in the communities where they or their recent ancestors were enslaved, Harritan and Afro-Mauritanian people in these places have little means to escape slavery in its entirety. In a best-case scenario, they can move from one form of the practice to another. Of course, none of this is legal in Mauritania anymore, at least not officially. But although France had tried to outlaw slavery as early as 1905, and although the ruling government in Mauritania has pledged to end the practice more than once, those decisions have always gone unenforced. Back in the days of French rule, the reasons were purportedly ones of respect for the local traditions and culture and protection of the economies that made the French colony there profitable. As time went on, France chose to make a distinction between the slave trade, the capture, sale into servitude, and often the shipment abroad of human beings for work in forced labor, and domestic slavery, which France took far less interest in. The French believed that domestic slavery was permitted by Islam, or at least that's what local religious leaders told them, and in the interests of preserving relations with its unusually stable colony, France was quite happy to accept that premise. Not only that, but Mauritania's slave owners were the same people deemed politically powerful enough to participate in France's hybrid colonial and local government. It was in the interest of all sides, except the slaves, of course, to maintain the status quo, and thus it was maintained. After Mauritanian independence, the anti-abolition factions within the country drew from arguments about how abolition could have stood in the way of decolonization. By their logic, slave owners, slaves, and formerly enslaved people were bound in a social network to each other, with even former slaves still dependent on the people who had once kept them as property. Disrupt those ties, disrupt those social structures, and as the anti-abolitionists told it, Mauritania's long-preserved tribal structure would disintegrate. Around that time in history, conversations across Africa around the practice and conduct of new states had much more to do with ideas of sovereignty, modernization, and economic freedom, and much less with imposing a consistent approach to social or labor issues. So in reality, the persistence of Mauritanian slavery became something of an afterthought. Now, with all of that being said, it's important to emphasize that fewer Mauritanians are enslaved today, at least as a proportion of the population, than have been enslaved in many generations. The reasons are partially political, as drought, war, famine, and other threats pushed higher numbers of Harritan, including enslaved people, to cities like Nouakchott. Their plight has been far harder to ignore, and they've been able to mobilize into emancipation and reform movements. Those have not gone easily. Many Harritan have been tortured, exiled, killed, and even forced back into slavery for their participation, especially during the 1970s. But gradually, they've been able to effect change. Partly international pressure has made a difference. Occasional media features reporting on Mauritania's reality have been successful in gaining the shock and horror of global audiences, and they've put pressure on nations, especially France and the United States, to more effectively exert leverage on Mauritania to fix the problem. But even that has come with caveats. For example, when a UN investigation in the 1980s condemned the lingering slavery of the Mauritanian system, the government used the report to solicit more aid, arguing that without it, emancipation wouldn't be possible. Finally, some of the shrinking of the enslaved population has come down to political convenience. Not only could new rounds of junta generals and civilian politicians benefit by trying to gain the support of Haratin voters, but they could gain precious legitimacy in the eyes of the world by vowing to end the practice and making enough progress toward that goal to gain them the tolerance of other African nations and the international community. Yet even as the rates of chattel slavery decrease in Mauritania year over year, the societal structure that enables slavery is far harder to displace. Not only does Mauritanian slavery thrive based off the closeness of its isolated communities and roving bands, where the only society and the only law that matters are those of the community, but it relies on a far deeper caste system that is no closer to being upended today as it's ever been. It would be easy enough to break Mauritania conceptually into two classes, the Badan and the Haratin. But that's not quite true either, because we've also got to account for the Afro-Mauritanians, the Africans of sub-Saharan descent who tend to cluster in the cities and southern towns, and whose ancestors came north to Mauritania. The Haratin are, by Mauritanian cultural logic, a caste within the country's caste system. More precisely, they are the slave caste. But in Mauritania, the slave caste is not necessarily the only low caste, and it's not necessarily the lowest of the low. The Badan and the Haratin alike share the same Arab-Moorish heritage. That is to say, they're distinguished by race, but they're bound by ethnicity. The Afro-Mauritanians are not. Put another way, a Haratin person enslaved to the Badan is a slave, but they were also higher on the Mauritanian social ladder than Afro-Mauritanian slaves, or even Afro-Mauritanian free people. In fact, it's not unheard of for free Haratin to even keep their own Afro-Mauritanian slaves, or for Afro-Mauritanians to keep Haratin slaves, making the entire situation within Mauritania far less of an issue of skin color and far more an issue of class and ethnicity. Both the Haratin and the Afro-Mauritanians have little control over Mauritania's political structure. Both groups live in poverty, and both, at times, experience slavery. But the position of the Haratin, in relation to the wealthier, more powerful Badan, is a lineage that stretches back into ancient history. The position of the Afro-Mauritanians does not, and Mauritania's modern history has only seen the two groups driven further apart. Many more Afro-Mauritanians can still remember times when they feared torture and ethnic cleansing from Haratin soldiers during the 1990s, and many Haratin can remember Afro-Mauritanians trying to make their way in the country, but knowingly or unknowingly infringing on the essential relationship that Haratin laborers and even slaves shared with the Badan as a matter of survival. For this reason, Mauritanian slavery has been harder to address internationally and harder to educate the global public about, since it both embraces and rejects elements of the race-based slavery that dominated so much of history. It's also caused Haratin to push back against total emancipation on the grounds that lumping they and Mauritania's other black enslaved peoples together would undermine their social standing or even be taken as an affront. For many Haratin, the perpetuation of slavery is a more tolerable situation than the upending of a social structure that works to their benefit. And all that isn't to say that the practice of slavery in Mauritania or anywhere else isn't reprehensible. It absolutely is. But it's also a fact of life in this place, and it provides a social structure for which there is no easy replacement. Reform in the sense that a person who's called a slave today might not be called a slave tomorrow is absolutely possible. But at a certain point, it's just semantics. Reform that would see the Haratin untethered from the Badan is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as more of a threat than a liberation. It's a destruction of a way of life or a place in a nation that has only ever had one way to live. And with slavery so deeply entrenched into Mauritanian culture, it should be no surprise that when people within the country seek to upset the status quo, they are often met with fear, skepticism, and at times, horrific violence. Mauritania does have an abolition movement, but its members risk their lives on a daily basis for what they believe in. In August of 2016, 13 members of the country's leading abolition movement were imprisoned for sentences of between 3 and 15 years on charges of rebellion after they protested the forced relocation of Heraton slum residents in Nouakchott, and according to the group's attorney, all 13 experienced torture while in the custody of state authorities. In 2014, a Mauritanian blogger was convicted on charges of blasphemy as a penalty for having criticized the caste system. It spent 5 years on death row before being released with help from international aid organizations. Mauritania is a land defined by its continued adherence to the practice of slavery, but it's not only a land defined by slavery. It's worth asking what might lie beyond and exploring what promise this country must have hidden among a horrific, centuries-old practice. But modern Mauritania doesn't provide many reasons for optimism, even looking beyond the practice of slavery. It's a very harsh, intensely repressive place, kept standing on shaky legs by a government and a society willing to destroy in order to preserve the legacy it holds so dear. We'll begin with a question of religion, or rather Mauritania's very strict set of expectations around the religiosity of its people. On the books, 100% of Mauritania's 4 million plus citizens are Muslim, no questions, no exceptions. In reality, a small proportion of the country's population, less than 1%, follows a religion other than Sunni Islam, and a small handful of Christian and Roman Catholic establishments do exist in the country. However, even those establishments prohibit the entry of local citizens who could face persecution if they were to enter, and other religions are entirely without representation. Worst of all is to be an atheist, which is, in Mauritania, a crime punishable by death. With Islam considered to be the single critical thread that weaves Mauritania's current system together, blasphemy too, also punishable by death, as is apostasy, the renunciation of a certain religious belief, especially while pretending to be Muslim and blending into society. The death penalty for apostasy, by the way, isn't elective, it's automatic, and while executions on the basis of this have not occurred in Mauritania in recent years, individuals charged with the crime are sometimes killed for other alleged crimes, perhaps as an attempt to circumvent the Western scrutiny and backlash that would follow such a killing. And it's worth noting that neither apostasy nor blasphemy used to be mandatory capital offenses. The penalty of execution was made compulsory for both in the year 2018. Other than capital offenses, non-religiosity brings a wide range of punishments from Mauritanian society. Non-religious people are barred from government office, non-religious education is banned, and non-Muslims cannot be granted citizenship. NGOs and aid groups that are explicitly secular, atheist, or non-religious are functionally unable to do their work in the country, and people looking to practice other religions on Mauritanian soil must first gain government approval. Even when the capital punishment for religious offenses is slow to come from the government, it can be threatened by the rest of society. For example, in the 2014 trial of the blogger that we mentioned a moment ago, one Mauritanian preacher offered 4,000 euros to anyone who killed him, while another author, who wrote an article on the links between Mauritanian slavery and religion, had a businessman place a bounty on his head, equivalent to nearly $14,000. Homosexuality is viewed there with no more fondness. Under the country's Sharia code, adult Muslim men who engage in what the country's criminal code calls, quote, unnatural acts are subject to be publicly stoned to death. No stonings have been carried out to the knowledge of the rest of the world since the 1980s, but like apostasy laws, people charged with the crime have faced severe penalties as punishment for other questionable charges. Women engaging in same-sex acts face lesser penalties, up to 2 years in Mauritania's brutal prisons. If all of that weren't bad enough, Mauritania is one of the world leaders in rates of female genital mutilation, or FGM, with nearly 70% of women and girls in the country as of the mid-2010s believed to have undergone some form of mutilation. In the country's northern half, rates were thought to be between 35 and 55%. In the country's southeast, 5 regions were estimated to have rates above 90%. The practice was especially common among poor and uneducated women and girls, particularly those living in rural areas who are, as we well know by now, also the demographics most likely to be enslaved. Statistics do suggest that the rate of FGM is declining somewhat, but international tracking organizations, lacking the specificity in their data to show which women in Mauritania still undergo the practice, have been insufficient in revealing which portions of the Mauritanian caste system are still subjected to it. And Mauritania also has another nasty element to its international reputation: the prevalence of human trafficking. Mauritania is believed to be both an origin nation and a destination for men, women, and children who are being trafficked, often for purposes of forced labor and commercial sexual exploitation. Of course, it should be no surprise to imagine that a place that condones the sale of human beings would see some of those people sold to foreign buyers who may then use the individuals they're trafficking for other ulterior motives, both in Mauritania and abroad. Girls, especially, are known to be trafficked in from nations like Mali, Senegal, and Gambia in order to be forced into domestic servitude, and so too have have been married out to wealthy men in the Middle East or forced into prostitution in the nations of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. For women and children to be forced into drug smuggling is not uncommon, while children from neighboring Senegal are coerced to enter Mauritania to work in the fishing industry and sex trafficking industry. The country is a common waypoint for sub-Saharan migrants traveling northward, and they too are commonly exploited for all sorts of vile purposes. The Mauritanian government has shown a clear disinterest in acting to stem the flow of human trafficking, and even if that interest was there, it may not be good for much. The same geographical isolation that enables the continuation of slavery also makes it easy to establish and use smuggling routes in a country where road infrastructure is built up just barely enough to allow passage, but where patrolling those roads and routes is just functionally impossible. And last, but certainly not least, are the allegations Mauritania has long faced on its use of torture. After the nation underwent its most recent coup in 2008, the regime that took power then, and still is in power now, has been accused of the systematic and coordinated use of torture against both criminals and political prisoners. In a report from the same year by Amnesty International, accounts were collected in aggregate showing, quote, the permanent and recurring use of torture as the only means of investigation employed by the security forces. Continues the report, quoting here, every individual detained for political reasons or under ordinary law runs the risk of being tortured. The 2008 report highlighted the use of suspending rigs that tied a detainee's hands and feet together, suspended them from an iron bar, and kept them there to be beaten. Also highlighted were the use of cigarettes to burn, the use of electric shock, and the use of sexual violence, as well as ritualized elements of the torturer's behavior. Frankly, most of their accounts within the report are not suitable for an episode like this, but the report is publicly accessible, should you wish to read it. More to the point, Mauritania has proven entirely disinterested in investigating allegations of torture, and the practice is believed to still be ongoing at a large scale to this day. In many cases, the identities, roles, motivations, and whereabouts of the perpetrators are known, but nothing is done. Before we conclude our episode, we're driven to ask a question we imagine many among our viewers might be asking: is there hope? In a place that enshrines both chattel and modern slavery as a cornerstone to society, in a place that happily hands out death and torture for minor affronts, and in a place where modern law would be nearly unenforceable even if there were the will to enforce it, is there hope for a better future? Well, as we turn in our final chapter to look at Mauritania in the grand view, we'll leave it to you to decide for yourself, but it's not really looking good. First, there's the matter of the scattered, isolated communities that make up Mauritania, and the open question of whether they could ever be brought together in a way that pushes Badan and Haratin and the Afro-Mauritanian population alike into a new way of living. Unfortunately, that is going to be hard to do. Desertification has all but won its battle in Mauritania to the extent that today, by recent estimates, just 0.2% of all land in Mauritania is able to be farmed. The rest is a wasteland. The oceans are teeming with fish, and that'll at least get the population somewhere, but it's a small piece of a puzzle that hardly looks solvable. At present, the only way to support Mauritanians entirely on the lands of Mauritania would be to reverse the country's near-complete desertification, in a process tantamount to battling against the Sahara itself. Such a task isn't just Herculean, it's impossible. Without that, the country will continue to rely on its disparate supply networks from neighbor nations and foreign aid organizations, and without a change to that status quo, there's little reason to change anything else. And when Mauritanians have come together in recent years, the results have not been extraordinary. Take the capital of Nouakchott, initially designed to host an estimated population of 15,000 people. In 2019, at the most recent census, the population was close to 1.2 million. The vast majority of people there live in overcrowded slums with limited infrastructure, soil and air that grows drier and drier, and few prospects for change. The problems that drove people there still exist: the droughts, the desertification, and in some cases, the threat of violence from enslavers far afield. And the same barriers that kept people from returning to their nomadic bands and their smaller communities years ago have only gotten worse. Those communities can't support new arrivals anymore. Even if, say, Haratin ex-slaves were to go back and throw themselves fully into bondage with their old enslavers again, there simply isn't enough out there to feed yet more mouths. Even the country's iconic railway, now carrying up to 17,000 tons of iron on every ultra-long train, represents a tenuous and single point of failure as it transports a critical resource without which the country would be in even more dire straits. All up and down Mauritanian society are stress points and ways for things to go wrong. An oil spill off the coast, a stretch of worn-away track on the railroad, a security threat forcing people out of the capital, or the further increases in desert heat that the world now knows is coming. Any one of those will upset the highly vulnerable ecosystem that is Mauritania in ways that cannot be taken back. And let's talk about the railway, or more accurately, let's talk about the resources. Mauritania has abundant natural assets, both in its wastelands and offshore. It hosts some of the most abundant iron ore deposits in the world. It has highly lucrative gold to be mined, critical copper to be pulled from the ground and sent around the world. It's even got offshore oil reserves, and perhaps even inland ones. Yet Mauritania's problems are such that it lacks the means to harvest any of those assets. Its government and its private industry cannot fund the equipment. Its people cannot move en masse to the harsh badlands where these resources are located, and in a grand view, it's highly unlikely that Mauritania could leverage those resources on any timescale quicker than decades. But as keen observers of international geopolitics already know, the simple fact that a country cannot harvest its own resources doesn't mean that those resources will go unharvested. Instead, like a number of other nations around the world, and especially in Africa, Mauritania has found itself in the crosshairs of a wide range of wealthier foreign countries. The subheading to a 2023 foreign policy article titled "Why Everyone is Courting Mauritania" summed it up well, quoting, "NATO, China, Russia, and regional powers all want closer ties to a stable West African nation with crucial energy supplies and a strategically valuable location." At the core of Mauritania's appeal is its political stability. Despite its long history of coups, it's got nothing on the other nations of the Sahel: Chad, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, each of which have suffered political upheaval and junta control far more recently than Mauritania has. While those other nations are widely seen as volatile and untrustworthy for international partnerships, Mauritania is seen as a steady hand in the region. And as history has shown many times, larger international powers are willing to look past a hell of a lot on the human rights end if they believe that a nation can be stabilizing in a region. That's true if we're talking about the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Europeans, or just about anyone else, and it's true in Mauritania too. China has made no secret of its willingness to invest in the country. All the way back in the 1980s, a Chinese company built the friendship port of Nouakchott, an artificial deep water port in which China regularly pours major investments into even today. In 2006, the CCP began cooperating with Mauritania to drill oil wells and start prospecting, and at the time of writing, China is believed to be on the brink of discovering major onshore reserves of oil that are believed to way eclipse anything Mauritania has in its territorial waters. In 2018, Mauritania joined China's Belt and Road Initiative, and in 2023, Mauritania's president joined Xi Jinping in Chengdu to sign expansive agreements getting China involved with everything from green energy to fisheries in the poor African nation. China is also hard at work developing a major port on the banks of the Senegal River, despite a whole raft of corruption allegations that have come with the project. To the United States, Mauritania is increasingly looking like the linchpin of America's and thus NATO's counterterrorism strategy in the Sahel region. Although the US had previously relied on bases in Niger to run its counterterrorism operations, Niger has recently kicked the US out after the country's recent coup saw its new political leaders generally opposed to cooperation with the Americans. Mauritania, though, hasn't experienced a terror attack since 2011, until that is a series of small clashes with Al-Qaeda that are actually still ongoing at the time of writing. The country is known for its own internal counterterrorism efforts using small mobile desert units, and by process of elimination, it's looking like America's best possible partner in the region. As of now, US Africa Command hasn't announced any plans for a Mauritanian cooperation effort, but if one emerges shortly, we certainly won't be surprised. When in 2022, the US State Department wrote its annual report on terrorism in Mauritania, the first sentence of that report said all that needed to be said. Quoting here, "The country remains an excellent security and regional counterterrorism CT partner for the United States." Not only that, but with Russia and the remains of its Wagner mercenary group, now ostensibly part of the Russian military, operating in neighboring Mali, the list of reasons only grows longer for the US or a NATO ally to start placing assets in Mauritania's desert. And to Europe, Mauritania is becoming more and more of a tempting strategic partner as the nations of the EU work hard to wean themselves off Russian-supplied energy. Current projections expect that Mauritania will begin exporting LNG, or liquefied natural gas, to Europe by the end of this year as part of a large-scale effort by the BP company to build infrastructure there. Its oil reserves, although currently expected to end up under Chinese control, could certainly be exported northward to Europe, and as the world shifts to renewable energies, another prospect has emerged. Mauritania features some 700,000 square kilometers worth of land, that's 275,000 square miles, that are quite literally perfect for foreign investors to build solar panels and wind turbines. Even a small proportion of that land, if it were to be converted for power generation, could generate incredible amounts of energy. On a related note, 2023 saw Germany, the UAE, and Egypt sign a three-way agreement to embark on a massive green hydrogen project in Mauritania with an estimated price tag of $34 billion when it's all said and done. The agreement could generate up to 8 million metric tons of green hydrogen per year, every year. Russia has taken notice of humbled little Mauritania too. On the one hand, Mauritania has recently accused Russian former Wagner elements of chasing militants from Mali into Mauritania in an event that saw the Russian ex-mercenaries kill Mauritanian civilians. But on the other hand, Russia has worked hard to keep and expand its fishing rights in Mauritania's coastal waters, even sending Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to Nouakchott personally in 2023 during the height of the Russia-Ukrainian war. Russia has offered to train Mauritanian doctors, reconcile with Mauritania even though it voted for Ukrainian causes in the UN, and to assist in clamping down on terrorism offshore, likely by sending more ex-Wagner troops to do the job. And finally, Saudi Arabia has poured money into Mauritania, including a massive investment into the city of Kaifa to provide potable drinking water. In 2017, Saudi Arabia agreed to train the Mauritanian military, and for decades, a Saudi-built mosque has been a jewel within the city of Nouakchott. As if to counter Saudi interests, the UAE has funneled the equivalent of $2 billion into an infrastructure initiative in 2020, equivalent to 40% of Mauritania's entire GDP for that year. Qatar, too, got in on the action, acquiring a 40% stake in a Mauritanian offshore oil exploration project in 2023, and in that same year, Turkey agreed to significantly increase commercial partnerships with the nation too. Mauritania has stayed active in African affairs, with its current president having just assumed the chairpersonship of the African Union this last February, and it's becoming a critical asset in keeping lines of communication open with the Sahel's junta-controlled states despite their opposition to the West. Even the Mauritanian national football team has seen an incredible change of fortunes. After going 0-33 in their matches between 1995 and 2003, foreign money poured into the team and made it competitive with the rest of Africa. Yet in all that foreign wheeling and dealing, in all the conversation of new prospects for Mauritania, grand investments and renewed potential, there's one topic of discussion that's remained conspicuously absent: the nature of Mauritania itself. Nowhere in the discussion of military cooperation with the US, energy investment by Europe, or infrastructure projects by China has there been any recognition that this is a place where tens of thousands at a minimum are still kept enslaved. There has been no acknowledgement of the hundreds of thousands more living under slavery's more modern iterations. There has been no attempt to reckon with the implications or the burden of responsibility that come with supporting a regime that looks the other way when children are sold into marriage, when women and girls are subjected to bodily mutilation, or when an entire caste of people are pressed into servitude with no other option, and when officials acting on the state's behalf choose to deliver incredible pain and suffering on their victims simply because they can. The story of Mauritania is a story of deep and profound suffering, a story of a land and a people with real, undeniable potential, but practically nobody in a position of power, either inside the nation or outside it, with the slightest interest in prioritizing human potential over human greed and political expediency. It's a place where the horrors of the world are on full display, and where, even though those horrors are worthy of condemnation, they also demand nuance and demand consideration if they are ever to be understood at all. It's a place that, against all odds, has been able to preserve its way of life for centuries, in a world where that way of life has long since been left behind.